Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mac Taylor, Legislative Analyst. And about an hour and a half ago, our office released the overview of the governor's budget. This is something we do every year, a couple of days after the governor has released his budget, just to give the legislature our initial assessment. Clearly, we haven't had time and haven't even seen all the details of the plan to be offering more detailed criticisms and review of his proposals. But we wanted to get some comments out there as quickly as possible as they start their deliberations, especially with a special session starting so soon. Let me first just talk about the problem definition. Some of you may remember in November we came out with our fiscal outlook where we found a $20.7 billion problem. The governor's comparable number is $18.9 billion, so a little bit less. And if some of you are thinking about that $19.9 billion, that's simply because he has a $1 billion reserve. But if you're comparing operating deficit to operating deficit, it's the 20.7 that we had in November versus the 18.9 now. We would say that the governor's assessment of the problem is realistic. We do believe there is still some downside risk, both on the expenditure side and on pieces of the revenues. We think his corporate taxation forecast is a little bit optimistic, and he also has some revenues for which there is no detail, a $450 million kind of plug number. So until we find out what that consists of, it's hard to kind of assess that. But overall, it's a reasonable starting point, at least, for the legislature's deliberations on the problem. Now, what are some of the key concerns that we identify in the piece? I think the biggest one is something that there's already been a lot of discussion about, and that is how much federal funds could the state reasonably expect to get. The administration is counting on $6.9 billion in additional federal funds. He's also counting on added flexibility from the federal government that would get them basically more than $1 billion on top of that 6.9. And while we certainly agree that the governor and the state should aggressively pursue whatever federal funds it can, I think it's another matter of how much you assume you're going to get for your budgetary deliberations. And we think the 6.9 is way too high. We think it may be reasonable to assume something less than half of that, around the $3 billion level. There's nothing magical about that. It's just that you do have some federal legislation that has been considered that would extend the Medi-Cal so-called FMAP participation. And the state could certainly make a good case in other areas. But I think for their planning purposes, we think that's just way too high. Let me point out some other concerns we have with the rest of the governor's proposals. He does have a lot of expenditure reductions and program reductions that he's proposing to his credit as a way to try to get the state's fiscal situation back in balance. But with a budget and a situation as dire as we're in, there are going to be problems with, I think, any proposals put on the table, and let me just identify a few. First of all, there are some that are just problematic on whether we can get the savings. And let me talk about the assumption about the receiver in the Department of Corrections. He's assuming that beginning July 1, we can reduce our health care costs basically in half to the level that New York State spends. Now, that may be a reasonable longer-term goal. We just don't know how we can get there as quickly as the governor is assuming we'll get there. So if not, you're clearly not going to have the solution that he's counting on. There are other proposals that have legal problems, and the state obviously has already run into serious court-related challenges on past assumptions, but let me just give you another example. The governor is assuming that we can require state employees, existing state employees, to pay an additional 5% of their salary towards the retirement in lieu of the state's contribution for a savings. We have doubts on whether that can be implemented just under various case law. So that clearly poses a serious legal challenge. There may be others that are just not fiscally sound, and let me give you one good example. The governor, under his trigger proposal, that if we don't get the federal receipt of funds to the level that he's assuming, he would eliminate the IHSS program, the In-Home Supportive Services Program, which provides basically in-home care to people who are at risk of being institutionalized. And in our view, you can make reductions in the IHSS program, but at the level that the governor is talking about, and especially if he eliminates it, we think there clearly would be many people who would go into the Medi-Cal program, and it would end up costing the state money. So at the level that the governor is making these proposed reductions, we think it could be actually a loser for the state fiscally. So that doesn't mean you can't, this legislature shouldn't look at ways to reduce IHSS costs, but be very careful of how far it goes in doing so. There are other proposals clearly that are very severe. The elimination of CalWORKs he's proposing again, as he did last year, the elimination of IHSS, the elimination of Healthy Families. And in those cases, the legislature obviously is going to have severe concerns with that, but we will be putting in proposals that offer alternatives to those reductions to give them as many options as possible. Let me briefly mention the governor's proposal on Prop 98, because it involves a kind of veering away from, I guess, the deal that was cut last year regarding the so-called maintenance factor that was generated in the 2008-9 year. The governor is assuming we're in a test 1 year in 2008-9 and that we would not legally have an obligation towards this maintenance factor, but they still propose that we pay it off, but in a different way. It gets very technical, very complicated, but I think that the statutory fix that was agreed upon to what is in fact a constitutional problem may have to be revisited given the governor's proposal. We do not think that that has to be done now, that is in the special session, even though that's probably the single largest solution that the governor is counting on in the special session. That does not have to be done even by, say, March or April. It has to be done before the end of the year, probably. But that will be, I think, an important issue in the debate. And the legislature, bottom line, will have to decide how much can we afford to pay to schools in the 2010-11 year, regardless of all the legal issues. He's proposing to keep spending roughly flat in 10-11 with the amount that we are spending in 9-10. And it may be that that's all the state can afford to do, and the question is, how do you get to that amount? Do you revisit this deal? Do you suspend? Whatever. But we think it's more important to just try to decide how much can you afford to give to schools given all of the other hefty reductions you're going to have to make to balance this budget. So kind of bottom line, what do we think the legislature should do? The first issue is one of timing, and that is, what do they have to do in the special session? We would say that they don't necessarily have to do a whole lot in the special session per se. What they need to do is act fairly quickly, say by the end of March, because many of the proposals involve reductions to health, social services, corrections, where you need lead time. So even if they don't have to be done in the 45-day special session period, they do need to be in place by the end of March if you want full year reductions to take place. So we would recommend that the legislature start acting early, make decisions, and try to have those that involve particularly those programs have whatever solutions that they're going to make, have them in place by the end of March. Finally, I would just say that the governor, to his credit, has put a lot of difficult proposals on the table. Clearly, the legislature will not like many of them and will have to consider options. And as always, we will be helping them in providing some of those options in the course of dealing with the special session and in responding to our kind of more normal analysis period. Let me just mention for all of your perspectives, we did not put out our traditional blue book analysis last year. I don't think we'll be doing that this year. And in part it's because, first of all, we're going to be responding to whatever the legislature needs for the special session. And clearly we can't wait till the end of February when the special session would be over by that time. So we may be putting out shorter documents. We hope to have a list on our website that will track all of our recommendations that we made. I hope that all of you find that of help, that you can always go to our website to find those. And we plan on having, similarly to what we did last year when we put out a series of almost program area briefs or little chapters, we won't put out as many of those, but we plan on putting out 4 or 5 towards the end of February or early March. that will have our kind of big picture analysis of issues that the legislature will still need to consider in putting together its final budget. So we're just going to have to be flexible, given that this, again, is a very unusual year, and we first and foremost want to respond to whatever our bosses need in helping them deal with this budget situation.